All right, it's 7 p.m. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Practical Farmers of Iowa Farminar for this evening. Tonight's topic is cereal rye, stand evaluation, and seed selection. We're going to hear first from Greg Roth and then from farmer Tim Sieren. Before we get started, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about Practical Farmers of Iowa. Practical Farmers was started in 1985. Farmers really looking to make the most of the inputs they were putting on the farm, wanting to make decisions that were driven by research that showed them how to be profitable on their farm. And really, we've taken this mission to mean that we're here to strengthen farms and communities by helping farmers with this research, on-farm research, and then helping them share that information with the greater farming community and friends of farmers across Iowa. We really welcome everyone to our membership. Some of the core values that I see every day, creativity and collaboration. Our members really tell us that they find a sense of community in the other members. We're focused on stewardship and ecology that will really help our farms for generations to come. A lot of the materials that we provide through Practical Farmers are free to the public, much like this Farminar tonight. Most of our field days are open to the public. And our website is a wealth of information, all of the research reports from the on-farm research, as long as a up-to-date blog and such. All this information is free to the public, but if you find yourself accessing a lot of our information all the time, you find that you like what we provide, we certainly welcome your membership. We are member-driven. Becoming a member allows you to sort of be part of the discussion on how Practical Farmers does what we do. There are a few member perks as well. An email discussion list that's usually full of robust conversation. We have a general list and then one's focused towards each of our practice areas, livestock, field crops. We have a cover crops email discussion list as well as a policy and a couple others. So if you're interested in that, check out our website to become a member. Also on the website, we have an events calendar. You can find events that are in your area. We list on our calendar both our events and then also events as our partners. One of the big things that's really on our calendar a lot these days is the play Map of My Kingdom, which is a play that Practical Farmers commissioned to talk about and to help people engage in the story of transitioning in their farms to the next generation. It's been a really big hit, so if you check out our calendar, you might find a viewing near you. Like I said, this is our Farminar series. This is the third in our series of small grains focused Farminars. Next week, we're going to shift gears, talk about custom grazing with goats. The same time every night through the fall and winter, 7 p.m. on Tuesdays. Said this is the third of our small grains knowledge project, and small grains is something that our members have told us that they're interested in growing. Some of our founding members and others have experience with diverse rotations, and they really see them to be a useful strategy on their farm. At other times, there seems to be growing interest, or from other angle, there seems to be growing interest in small grains, be it for feeding livestock on the farm, or as we're going to talk about tonight, cover crop seed production. And so we have farmers telling us that they're interested in diverse rotations, but there's not a lot of these small grains being grown on the Iowa landscape. 93% of all the cropland in Iowa is corn and beans, and so of people that are interested in small grains don't necessarily have a neighbor to talk to. The grains have probably been growing on their farm, but maybe not since their grandpa's generation. And so the farmers we're talking to on our networks and elsewhere are telling them that small grains have really helped them to become less reliant on some of their chemical and fuel inputs. They can get away with less fertilizer, especially when they're growing a legume interseeded with their small grains, which we'll also hear about tonight. So less than relying on fertilizers, and really harnessing ecology to help disrupt pest and weed cycles. It's a soil building practice. And then really one thing I hear more and more the more folks I talk to is this idea of small grains really helping to spread out the workload. So as farms are tending to get bigger, there's more, with more corn and beans, that's a really crunched window. And so if you can go take care of some of your acreage early and then get a few acres harvested before corn and bean harvest really comes on. It can really help to spread out that workload and sort of have a more even pace to the harvest life. And so with this project, been really trying to talk to a lot of folks and get this information out there. And so I'd encourage you to look at some of the articles that are coming out of this project. Also, Farminars, we've had 3. This will be 3 in this session. And then also the last session had articles with the one gentleman here that you can see on the page, Dick Sloan. So you can check those out on our website, the Farminar archives. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I turn it over to Greg. A lot of you already, I can see, entering your name and email, and your location email rather, in the chat box. The chat box is also where we'll ask questions throughout the session. We're going to try to reserve the last 20 or 30 minutes or so for questions, but as they pop up, feel free to type them in the box, and Greg or Tim will take care of them sort of as they go through their session. So that's pretty much my spiel. I'm going to pull up Greg's document here, and I'm going to turn it over to him. So I clicked over there. All right, this is Greg Roth from Penn State Extension. Greg, thank you very much for your time tonight. Looking forward to what you have to say, so I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you, Drake. And it's a pleasure being with you folks tonight. I've been a professor here at Penn State for a number of years. I'm the extension grain specialist, and I've been here since '89, and I kind of head up our work on, it sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but head up our work on corn testing. In fact, I think our guys told me we have a joint project with the Practical Farmers testing some, I guess, non-GMO and organic corn, and soybeans, wheat, barley, and sorghum. And then some interesting projects I'm involved in addition to that, are testing some heritage grains, some different value-added crops I'll talk about tonight. And we have a big project on interseeding cover crops. And then I also help with a on-farm soybean management research program. So I kind of have been keeping myself pretty busy, and fortunate to work with a lot of sharp folks and farmers, kind of like you guys. And I usually end up learning more from them than they do from me. But together, I think we've accomplished a lot of interesting things over the years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about rye. As you guys know, we're focusing on winter rye, and that's a cereal grain that we plant in the fall and harvest in the following spring. That's not to be confused with something like ryegrass, which is an annual or a perennial grass used for cover crops, forage, and turf. And you might know that winter rye is the most winter hardy of all the cereal grains, and that's valuable when, especially in our northern climate we're in. I'm just located right off of Interstate 80, and it's probably about a 14-hour drive to Iowa from here. So if you ever want to come see us, the directions aren't too difficult. And one of the issues about rye is that there's just not been a lot of development work on rye over the last 20 or 25 years that I know about. There might be a little bit out your way in Minnesota, I believe, but we grow a lot of old varieties, and that's partially due to the lack of a good grain market, and then a lot of farmers replant the seed, so that frustrates the breeders and doesn't create a lot of revenues for them to invest back in breeding. So many of the varieties we end up using are over 25 years old, and that hasn't helped this crop keep up with advances in corn and soybeans that many of you are familiar with that have occurred during that time period. You probably know that Pennsylvania is a big dairy and livestock state, and we have a lot of poultry and hogs also. So we have a lot of animal manure, and we're upstream from the Chesapeake Bay. And for the last 25 years, we've been concerned about nutrient management, and cover crops have been increasingly important. Also, another thing that's real popular in our state is no-till. So I think about 60% of our corn is no-tilled, and about 80% of our soybeans, and a lot of our cover crops like this rye in this picture is no-tilled as well. And cover crops vary, I think, in how they're managed, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There's one philosophy. The traditional one is burn down the cover crop 10 days to 2 weeks ahead of corn planting, and that helps to warm up the soil and get the corn going. That's been the traditional mindset. More recently, my colleagues and farmers in the state that have been experimenting with other techniques. One is in organic systems, trying to let the rye go to heading and then roll it down. And then another one, it would be let the rye grow up and then plant right into the tall rye green. And I'll talk about that. Another real big thing has been harvesting the rye for forage in the spring. This has become real popular in the last few years as the dairy industry has really suffered with the high grain prices and the high cost of forage. So they've tried to get every shred of homegrown forage they can, and they found by intensifying their crop rotations with small grains, double crop with corn silage, they can do that. And then another interesting market we have is growing rye for straw that I'll tell you about. I realize some of this is probably different. The markets are different here, but I always like to learn about what other folks are doing, and gives me some ideas which might be possible in my area. And this just our basic cover crop management is goes something like this: seed immediately following corn silage harvest at about 120 pounds per acre. And again, our guys would no-till right after the chop the corn, and the corn chopping usually involves a big chopper, dump trucks maybe, and it occurs in maybe late August through September. And they really like to seed immediately following harvest because the soil still has a little moisture in, and get better drill penetration, seed to soil contact. And if you let the soil that's freshly chopped corn silage dry out for 3 or 4 days, it can get hard as concrete and then become difficult to operate your no-till drill in. And usually farmers just doing this for cover crop are real cost conscious, so they're thinking about VNS or varieties or even bin run seed, and they might want to use a early rye variety just because it grows a little more in the fall and matures early in the spring, and makes as much biomass as possible in the relatively short window between the fall growth and when they want to do their early corn planting. And then they'll kill it with glyphosate 7 to 10 days prior to planting corn in the spring, and it works pretty well. A couple things that happen sometimes. Sometimes without corn silage and other crops like soybeans or corn, it gets pretty late in the season, and you still seed rye like this, but we don't get much fall growth or utility from the rye. And then in the spring, with early corn planting, we don't get a lot of biomass accumulation. So the benefits of the rye planting is the late rye planting are a little bit minimized in that kind of system with corn, grain, and soybeans. Shifting to a little earlier varieties will facilitate a little earlier planting. And the other thing that farmers have been doing is to qualify for no-till, whatever benefits they get conservation-wise. They'll avoid. Some of them will avoid using vertical tillage to process their stalks, which is one tactic. But if you plant rye, you're basically planting a no-till crop and processing the corn stalk. So even if the rye doesn't grow that much, you've kind of made a little bit more uniform seed bed for the soybeans next year. And with soybeans planting a little bit later, you do get more growth. Another big one is then rye for forage. This kind of goes the same way, but one difference is there'll be some overwinter manure applied, and then that would be followed up with 60 to 70 pounds of N at green up in the spring, and that produce a pretty dense, high-yielding forage crop, and then they'll let that grow to the flag leaf stage, and that's just when the last leaf is fully emerged, and then they'll chop it for forage like this guy's doing in the picture. It will have to lay in that windrow a few days to dry out, and one problem is with the early varieties is they may be ready, and if planted in early like we talked about, they might be ready in early May. And as you know, just as in Iowa, sometimes in early May we get cool wet conditions, and this ryeage, as we call it, doesn't dry very quickly. So often folks prefer a little later rye variety for this, or they've been a lot of growth in triticale, which is later maturing. It'll mature in mid-May, and they'll take a little yield penalty on the corn, but maybe get a little yield increase on the small grain, and better conditions for making it in the field. If you want to get an example of how somebody's really taking advantage of feed production, making a quality feed, and protecting the groundwater and surface water with this kind of production, you might look at this little video we made last summer with one of our producers locally. I'm not going to play it here, but you could watch that. It's a 7-minute video. You get a kind of a good idea how we do small grain forage on Pennsylvania dairies. And so another one problem with the early burn down of rye is that you can go back in those fields in June and you wouldn't think there was any cover crop growing there. And in a silage cornfield, the second-year silage cornfield, there's a lot of bare soil. And in our soils, they're prone to drought stress. So we like to do things that create a surface mulch. So some farmers have been looking at ways that they can let the rye grow more, make more biomass, and protect the soil longer. So there's a couple cover crop groups, and there's a farmer named Charlie Martin who developed a planter attachment. I think if you click on this link, it'll take you to a fact sheet one of our seed companies made about Charlie and his planter. And they go into fields like this. They kind of they might cut back on the seeding rate some to like a bushel per acre, and then allow the rye to grow to the boot or even the early heading stage. So sometimes it could be 5 feet tall. It gives me the willies a little bit, but and then in mid to late May they'll run through with a corn planter and the corn planter knocks all that down flat and plants corn right in that residue. And then these guys will spray a herbicide to both kill the rye and provide some residual activity. and they're kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. We've got some research to try to validate what they're doing, but we have several guys that are doing this on several hundred acres now. And there's a group in Pennsylvania called the No-Till Alliance. It's kind of like the Practical Farmers, and they try tactics like this, and they don't believe they're taking that much of a yield penalty, and they're getting mulch later in the season that we're not getting with the earlier burn down of the rye. So that's what we call planting green, and you can read more about it on that little handout if you're interested. And then we have a fair amount of organic research, both here in my department and also down at the Rodale Institute in eastern Pennsylvania. And over the years, one of the issues on our rolling landscape is intensive tillage associated with organic production can leave soils prone to erosion and reduce the soil structure. So folks have been experimenting with ways to do organic no-till, and especially, I guess the most successful has been organic no-till soybeans, and the concept has been let the cover crop rye grow up fairly tall, like this 5-foot stuff the guy's rolling down, and roll it down either in a separate operation, or as this guy has a tractor mounted roller in the front, and then plant right into that mashed down rye. The rollers crimp the rye every 6-8 inches or so, and thesis at this stage of growth, it generally doesn't come back. It's pretty dead, and then that field will turn yellow as the rye bleaches, and when all goes well, soybeans will emerge through that and won't require any cultivation for weed control. Now, I'm not involved in this research, but my colleagues are over the years, and you know, watching from the roadside, they're getting pretty good at growing organic no-till soybeans. I don't think they're going to set any soybean yield records, but they're growing some decent soybeans, and they'd be planting in late May or early June. So that's another kind of thing that I see rye being used for. And then another one is something called pre-cut rye for straw. And one of our extension agents down in southeast Pennsylvania is a farmer too, and he's mastered this one, as some of the farmers who have premium straw markets have worked on this, and they can grow rye and not have to have a combine. Basically what they do is they'll seed rye following corn silage or grain, and they'll seed it right up to Thanksgiving, maybe increasing the seeding rate as you get late, and then that stuff will germinate in the fall and grow in the spring, and they'll allow it to grow to heading, but try to catch it before it flowers, since the flowers can, my colleague tells me the flowers clog your radiator and blow around and are undesirable. They'll mow it and they'll spread the windrows out with a tedder, and they'll allow it to bleach, hopefully get a little rain on it and some sunshine, and it'll turn the rye from being green to yellow to almost white. And then they'll hopefully get some drying weather, and they'll rake that up and bale it in late May or early June. And they get about 3 tons of straw per acre, and they sell it to the horse industry, and they get about $200 a ton out of the field and about $250 out of the barn. So they'll get about $600 per acre for that high quality straw. And that's one of the benefits of being located next to New Jersey, where they have folks need straw like that and willing to pay for it. And then with it's kind of it's southern Pennsylvania, so they can come in early June and double crop with soybeans, and they'll get yields like 40 to 45 bushels to the acre. So you can see they've got a nice revenue stream when it's all said and done. A lot of nutrient removal in a deal like that, but and especially potash, we've noticed. So you have to pay attention to potash soil test levels, but they can do quite well. And again, there's a little link to an article he wrote on it if you want more details on the pre-cut straw opportunity. And then we do grow some rye for grain. It's pretty limited. Mostly it's grown for seed, cover crop seed, either by seed company folks or by farmers who want to grow a little bit of their own seed. And one of the challenges, the yields are often low and kind of disappointing, and they get about 40 bushels to the acre. The varieties are some of the older ones. A rustic is one that we use, or they're just VNS. And farmers tend to be pretty conservative with the nitrogen on these because standability is an issue. And I'd say probably 40, 50 pounds of N in the spring. And one of the problems we have is we do grow wheat, and it's possible to get 80 to 90 bushels of soft wheat. And it's hard to get motivated to grow rye if you're in having a close market to grow 80 or 90 bushels of wheat at $5.50 or $6 a bushel. So that's made it hard for the seed companies to get folks to grow rye. Also, because the forage market has been moving a little bit towards triticale, the demand for rye might be decreasing a little bit. That's a little different, and now we'll switch gears a little bit. That's a little different than what I've heard in Europe. And in Northern Europe, in like Germany, Poland, Russia, Sweden, they grow a lot of rye and they use it for flour and a feed grain for cattle and pigs. So even though we grow a lot of cattle and pigs here in Pennsylvania, it's very few farmers would actually be feeding rye as a grain. But according to the European experiences, that it is possible to do. In Europe, they've done a lot of breeding and variety development over the years. And if you go to this website, ryebelt.com, you can read, and it's in English, you can read a lot about how the Germans are breeding rye. And one of the things they came up with are hybrids, and they basically grow rye something like we grow seed corn, and it's expensive to grow a little bit, but it does produce kind of a uniform, high-yielding material. So I became familiar with this a couple years ago. There's a company, it's called KWS. They're kind of like a pioneer seed corn in Europe. They grow sugar beets and other crops. And I was on a sugar beet adventure one time, and I connected with a guy from KWS, got me seed, and one thing led to the other, and I ended up with some hybrid rye. And then I planted some and became a little familiar with it, and got some experience with it. So the hybrid rye tends to produce a more uniform looking crop. It tends to have a longer grain fill period, and we've noticed it makes rye that has a larger grain size. It's a little more stout than some of the varieties that we've been using. One of the diseases that rye gets is called ergot, and that's when a special fungus involves attacks the kind of unfertilized florets in the rye head, and it grows a black seed substitute, you could say, ends up in the seed. And if you get a lot of ergot in the seed, that can cause some animal production problems. Basically, it's like a hallucinogen, and it can be nasty. Occasionally, like once a year, our veterinarians at Penn State get some reports of horses getting into or grazing ergot contaminated rye or something like that. So it does happen. And then the other thing is the rye seed, the hybrid rye seed is fairly expensive. I don't have a great number, but I'm going to say about $40 for a 50-pound bag, so $40 a bushel or something like that. And KWS's vision is kind of this is the triple stack corn of rye, and that's how they like to think about it. And another market we had, I got an inquiry a few years ago, is what about rye for whiskey? And Pennsylvania passed some new laws that made local distilleries legal, and they've been cropping up over the countryside. So somebody called and asked, hey, what's a good rye to grow for whiskey making? My buddy's opening up a distillery in a little town here, and I'd like to grow some rye for him. So I got him some. I got some farmers some hybrid rye, and they went about and grew some rye. I did testing here. As it turned out, my guys weren't as good about collecting data, so I just sort of got some anecdotal observation that it yielded very well, stood well, and made it a good quality grain. Normally I like to get a little more data than that, but that's about all I was able to get out of this adventure. And they're used to make these premium whiskeys. The Dad's Hat on the right, that's in the Philadelphia area. The Wiggle whiskey is from Pittsburgh, and the Rocks Off is from Northwest PA, out in the wilderness, basically, where they don't grow many crops, but they find enough to grow a few rye fields to make vodka. And then another thing that's taken off here is microbreweries, and they're looking for malted grain, malted barley. And one of the guys that grew some recently posted on Twitter that they malted the rye. There's a demand for malted rye. So at least it was gratified that at least some of my rye ended up as vodka and now beer. So adding a new dimension to my job here at Penn State. Instead of just variety testing, I'm going to be doing variety tasting, which should be fun. And then another thing would be, just like you guys are talking about there, is whether or not there could be some emerging feed markets for small grains. I'm seeing some trend of that here too. We mostly feed corn and soybeans. We grow and import from other places, but one venture has grown some barley, and not regular barley, but some hulless barley that looks like, on the right, it looks a lot like rye, actually. And these guys are using it in a big layer operation. So we have two large layer operations that are growing barley and then double cropping with soybeans. And they're able to grow the barley, and then it opens up double cropping in more northern areas for them. Then another thing I've noticed is that our feed wheat, we have problems growing wheat. It gets vomitoxin in it, and it gets rejected. And when I started my career, geez, if the wheat got rejected, then you really took a yield hit. But with the high grain prices, some of our livestock feeding operations and poultry operations have figured out how to include wheat in the ration. So now folks tell me, feed wheat is not that discounted compared to flour wheat. So the industry is learning how to feed a little bit of small grains along with the corn and soybeans. So I'm wondering whether feed markets could develop for rye and other grains. Some of the advantages these days are generally low cost of seed. They're non-GMO. They provide straw, and then they provide the opportunity to do some double cropping. And those all add to, if you can, we're doing some other research to model the economics, and if you can get the straw and the double crop markets, those really add to the profitability of including small grains in a rotation. So we did some. I'm going to try to speed up. We did some evaluation of hybrid rye in 2012, and then 2000 that was minimal. And then in 2013 we planted some with our wheat trials in early October, and we seeded at 1 million and then 1.8 million seeds. That'd be about 2 bushels. And then Cornell has conducted 2 years of trials as well. This is Cornell data that look pretty impressive. Brasetto is a hybrid rye. A rustic is the common cover crop rye that farmers are trying to grow for seed. And these are the yield differences, over twice the yield of Brasetto compared to a rustic. And the lodging was a lot less with Brasetto compared to a rustic. And Brasetto was a couple days later. And then the other thing in this graph is the slight increase with increasing seed, but they didn't see that much. Could have almost got by with 750,000 seeds per acre. Normally we'd seed about 1.5 to 1.8 million seeds per acre in 2 bushels of rye. And then I did a trial following up on the Cornell work, and kind of found the same thing. A rustic is a tall, uneven cover crop rye early, and some of my yields I was able to match farmers' performance in this trial, and I knocked down 40 bushels per acre at both locations. And then the Brasetto came in just like the Cornell data at over twice the yield. 2014 we had the similar thing at one location, and then at a late planted location we didn't see quite the benefit, but still substantially better yield in with the Brasetto. And this is kind of what the stuff looks like in the bag. And then in 2014 I also compared a Brasetto at 65 pounds to 120 pounds to triticale and my rustic. This is one of the data points you just saw. And the main thing was at the low seeding rate, which turned out to be about 1 million seeds per acre, I got actually a higher yield than I did with the full seeding rate of this expensive rye, thinking that if you plant it early, you could probably get by with a little more than a bushel per acre, or something like 1 million seeds per acre. And the test weight was also good. Ours did lodge a little bit till we got it harvested, but we put about 100 pounds of N on in a single shot, and the guys from KWS would actually recommend splitting our spring N application, maybe to minimize lodging a bit. And then in the second year in Cornell, one thing they did, they switched to another open pollinated rye variety that's people are thinking about, called Danko, and that yielded a lot better than a rustic, but the Brasetto yielded very well. That's like 120 or 30 bushels to the acre of rye, and this is averaged over 4 locations. And also lodging was reduced with the Brasetto, and it was a little bit later than the open pollinated rye. So maybe this is telling me that maybe this Danko rye, it might be a lot better than a rustic for grain production, but still Brasetto is a very high. This hybrid rye is a very high yielding stuff. And here's a picture of the hybrid rye at one of my Northwest Pennsylvania location. Nice uniform, standing well, big heads, nice grain size. Looks like close to 100 bushel type of rye. And in Germany, they're thinking of this as a triple stack corn kind of management. They would seed it at 700,000 to 1,000,000 seeds. Try to plant it early, which is a problem in a lot of cropping systems, in late September, early October, inch to inch and a half seeding depth. Split the N application and go with about 1 pound per bushel. So if you're doing 120 bushel rye, you're going to be putting down maybe 20 pounds in the fall, 50 pounds early spring, and 50 pounds late spring. And then they're telling me avoid running down the rye with your sprayer to create weak plants that might be predisposed to ergot, because those rundown plants have more weak florets. And then one plus is that rye tends to have less of this fusarium head blight than wheat, but you can get fusarium head blight and you can spray with fungicides. So the hybrid rye seed was developed by KWS in Pennsylvania, and in the U.S. the only distributor now is Seedway. It's a Pennsylvania company, and KWS and its distributors do not support or authorize the sale of F2 or brown bag seed. It was one idea I had, or folks had in general, was, geez, could we grow this as our seed crop and then distribute it, that seed, as a cover crop? And to date, they're not too excited about that. They would rather see it developed as a feed crop. If you're interested in contacting somebody from Seedway about trying some out, here's a couple emails of 2 guys I work with. They'd be happy to discuss it with you. So it's a high yielding, expensive, and some issues on seed saving with that stuff. So in conclusion, rye has a lot of uses in our area, including some new value-added markets. And the hybrid rye appears to have high yield potential and good grain quality compared to some of the older varieties we've been working with. And to maximize the returns, they're recommending go with a low seed rate, boost the nitrogen, and plant it early. Not everybody has the chance to plant early like that, so I've got a little trial out that's got planted late, so we'll see how that goes. Replanting of the seed is not authorized, and I guess the other thing from our research and experience base is this other variety like Danko. Seedway sells Danko also, or triticale. They could be alternative high-yielding grain options. We've often got 100 bushels of triticale grain in our wheat trial, and they could be an alternative option that compared to the cover crop rye. So that concludes what I had. I know I've gone a little bit over probably, so I'm gonna turn it back over to Drake and go to the next step.
All right, thanks very much, Greg. That was great stuff. And please stick around for the question and answers. I'm sure this is going to generate some good questions later on, but I do want to turn it over to Tim. I'm uploading his file here right now. And so I think a lot of what you said is going to hit home and segue nicely into what I know Tim's going to tell us. I was fortunate enough to go to his field day this last summer, so I know a bit about his system, and pulling it up here. All right, Tim, are you all set?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I've got you loud and clear.
Okay. Yeah, my name's Tim Sieren. I farm at Kyoto, Iowa. We're in western Washington County. If you follow Interstate 80 over to Iowa City, then you go about 40 miles southwest, and that's where we're at in the southeast part of the state of Iowa. We've got a lot of rolling ground down this part of the country, but there's some good corn ground too. Well, you can see here in the picture, this was taken at our field day last summer, and this is typical of the ground that I farm. I got a lot of C and D slopes. A lot of it is between 50 and 70 CSR for corn. You you can kind of tell in that picture there, the corn in the foreground, there's a little bit on the yellow side. There's a yellow wet spot in that field there, but it did come out of it later in the season. We had a lot of rain in June there, so this is a picture of my family. This is me and my wife Ethel. We've got 2 daughters. Our oldest daughter has 4 boys, so we've got 4 grandsons, and then our youngest daughter, she's in grad school out at Nebraska. She's in the animal science program out there. So we hopefully got somebody to take over the farm someday, but right now it's up in the air. We got to get them growed up first. So this is a picture of our grain drill. I got started growing rye probably about 10, 12 years ago. I originally planted it as a forage crop to make more hay for the cows. My brother's the one who got me started on. He had a friend that was planting some in the county, and they did quite a few acres of it, and then we got started doing it. We had this no-till drill. This is a John Deere 750 drill. Dad bought it new back in 1990, and we no-till everything that we plant. All the corn is no-tilled into bean ground, and the beans are no-tilled into the corn stalks. And then this is the best way that I've found to plant rye. You get the best seed to soil contact. You get the best seeding rate. If you notice, we got a scale on there. We can measure our pounds per acre that we're putting on, so we can fairly accurately seed what we need. And then the tubes that are on there, this is the way I set it up to interseed the clover or the interseed in the rye after the rye comes up. We've got a seed box on the top there, and that's to use to put the clover seed. The smaller seeded covers go in there. So it works fairly well. The only problem with the drill is it's only 15 feet. So I come up with this idea. This is a broadcast seeder that I use on a 3-point hitch. Typically, I start seeding rye in the fall after we get the beans harvested. And this year, well, the last couple years, I put 100% of my bean ground in rye cover crop. And I bought this herd seeder, and it mounts on the, well, it's made to mount on the 3-point hitch of the tractor, but I made me some brackets and put a hydraulic drive on it so I can put it on the front of the tractor. And then we've got a rotary Phoenix harrow that I pull behind, and you can seed the cover crop about 3 times faster than you can with that drill that we saw in the other picture. The drill works good, but you got to have somebody run it, and as most farmers know, harvest time is a busy time, and if you don't have a designated drill driver, it's hard to get it put in on time. So that's why I came up with this. As soon as I get a field of beans combine, I'll take this out, and we did one whole farm first week in October this last fall here, and we just happened to get a little rain on it later, and then it really came up, and we had a nice stand on it. With this unit, I usually put on about between 70 and 80 pounds an acre. That seems to be heavy enough for a cover crop. If you're going to seed it for harvest, you need to put it on heavier than that. That 120 pound rate, like Greg was saying, is probably more or closer to getting a good enough stand for harvest. Here's the rear view of the drill. This kind of shows the setup. It's a single disc opener. We've got spade closing wheels on there that creates a little more dirt to close in the furrow, so you it gets a fairly decent stand, but like I said, you gotta run it. And 15 feet seems like you're not getting anything done after you get out of the combine and been combining with a 25-foot bean head. So we originally got this. We use this to put all our soybeans in. So it's kind of a double use, and that's another thing too with the drill. When you start putting rye in, you got to remember you're going to be doing a lot of acres of it. You're basically doubling your acres on that field. So the fields that we plant beans in, this drill puts all the beans in the spring, and then if you come back in the fall, use it for rye, you're going to be doing the same number of acres in the fall with it as you are in the spring. So that's something that you might want to consider when you're looking for something to seed rye. We got a lot of guys around here. We're not real big farmers. I farm with two brothers and my dad, and we share machinery, and I've got about 360 acres of crop, so I'm what you call a small farmer. But when you go doubling 200 acres of corn, or beans, you're talking 400 acres, when you're putting cover crops in. So it does take some time commitment, and if you want a good stand and good results, you got to put a little bit of effort into it, just like you do your corn or your beans. You can't go out there and just scatter it and expect it to grow. You can, if just for cover crop, you can get by with that, but you end up with some bare streaks, and we've got a lot of guys in the area that are trying aerial seeding. I've had a couple neighbors here last summer that did it, and I had one had real good luck with it, and then I had another one that didn't hardly anything grow. So the timing is really critical on the aerial seeding. But another reason why I wanted to try and get something besides this drill is because you start doubling the acres on it, and then you're just wearing it out faster, and it's kind of a high maintenance piece of equipment to keep up if you put a lot of acres through one in a year. We've got several farmers around the area that are going to the big 30-foot air seeders, and they're using that for cover crop, and they work great if you got the acres to justify them, but you're talking a pretty significant investment in piece of equipment for if you're just using it for cover crop. But a lot of guys are justifying them by using them for beans and then cover crops too. These drills were real popular when they came out back in the early 90s. You go up and down the road, and about every farmer owned one, and then they found out that they were going to be wearing them out, so a lot of them got rid of them and went to bigger 12 or 16 row planters, and they could take a bigger strip, and then they went to the double row 15-inch planters, and those are pretty popular in the area. And the drills are kind of making a comeback in our area. 5 years ago, you could buy a drill like this on a farm sale for less than $10,000, and now they're bringing up $15,000 to $20,000 for the same drill that was about half the price just 5-6 years ago. So that kind of shows you the increase in the interest in the cover crops. It's been good for the drill market, and one thing that's helped that is that the new ones have really gone up in price too compared to when these came out. So this is by far the best way to put it in if you got somebody to do it and you've got the time and the patience to run it. Here's a picture. I was out in the spring kind of doing a stand evaluation. This is a field of rye that I had seeded that I was originally planning on using for forage. What we do is we put it out in the fall after this was after corn harvest here in this case. But I've seeded rye up to the 10th of November, and as long as you get it germinated and sprouted, it will come up in the spring, and it'll get a fairly good growth on it if you leave it grow till the end of April or 1st of May. Which is kind of hard to do when the neighbor's out there planting corn on the 15th of April and you got a green patch of rye growing in the field. So it does take some little bit of patience to do it that way. But if you let it grow, you can get some pretty good growth on it, and you get your organic matter, and erosion control is the main reason I planted it, because you can see here, this is one of my fields. There's about from where I'm at down to the bottom of this waterway here, there's probably, I don't know, 75 feet of drop grade from that elevation there. So, you know, we're talking C to D slope. So we no-till everything, and that's the reason, partly because we have to for our conservation plan, because it's required that we no-till and drill our soybeans. So that's the reason for the no-till, and that's where the rye fits in nice. And after we started growing it for forage, and originally when I did that, we'd put it in the fall, usually on corn stalks like this. And then you come in the next spring, and you let it get up and get, just as it started heading, go out there with the mower conditioner or the mower and knock it down, and then we'd let it dry for about a day, and then we'd go in and windrow it and bale it up and wrap it wet for cow feed. And it was similar to what the haylage that Greg showed in that earlier slide there, where the guy was chopping it, but we don't have no chopper or equipment to do that, so we just bale it. And then there's a guy locally here that's got one of those forage wrappers, and we just wrap it in a row. And they say you want to harvest it at about 65% moisture, and then you wrap it in that plastic, and then it holds the carbon dioxide in and keeps the oxygen out. And then you let it in sow for 45 days, and you can start feeding it. So that's basically what I do. I've got a small cow herd, but I only got 4 acres of pasture, so that's my summer cow pasture. I don't have to dedicate any ground to pasture, and I don't have to put anything aside for hay. All the hay I feed them, well, I pasture them in the wintertime in the field here on the corn stalks and the waterways, and then I feed a little bit of hay in the spring, and then summer's rye season. It's really good forage, high quality forage, and the cows really love it. So here's a picture of my head that I set up last year. We've got a 9560 John Deere STS combine. It doesn't really take anything special from equipment to grow rye. A lot of guys do it with older equipment. That's one of the advantages of it. You don't have to have a new fancy combine. Ours is, I think, a 2005 model, so it's about 10 years old. But the problem I was having was getting it to feed in the head. We had a 625F grain head that we was using on soybeans, and that was just a little bit too wide of a head when you're combining rye, especially if you had any lodging and it was on the ground. It's hard to pick up. But last summer I found this head, and if you notice, the cutter bar is closer to the auger. It's a 218 rigid head. It originally came out of Nebraska, and that head's about 30 years old, but it really worked good. I put a head side header control on it. That's the yellow wand you see sticking there. I had to take them off to store it so it wouldn't flatten them out on the ground, but they mount underneath the cutter bar here, and they go down, and you got header control from about 3 inches up to 15 inches. And that made all the difference last summer when I was harvesting that rye that was flat on the ground, because you could just run your header control, whereas the flex head we use on soybeans didn't work very good, because you got to have it on the ground in order for the header control to work, and it just didn't. You either had to shave the ground, or else you had to guess where you were at, try and cutting it a foot high, and it was just about mind-boggling trying to run that thing. And then you go through a dip, and you'd scoop in a bunch of green stuff, and you had to plug the combine pretty fast. So this is an 18-foot head, and it's just about the ideal width. The reason I got an 18-foot is because I had a shed with a door I could get it in. I didn't need to buy another head cart. 20 foot would probably work on these bigger combines. The 9560 is a class 5 combine, so it's got plenty of capacity. But this 18-foot head leaves a nice windrow behind. The 25-foot head that we were using for beans would just leave a windrow about 4 feet tall behind you, and that's just too big of a windrow if you're going to bale the straw, especially if you're going to use a small baler, small square baler. So this one here just makes about the right size windrow, and you can drive over. You don't have to take a full cut, which sometimes just depends on how the field's laid out. But it really worked good. The header control worked a lot better than I thought it would. Also, I set this up. If you notice in this picture here, I've got plastic fingers in the center. I had to change the steel ones out for the rotary combine. They don't recommend that you run them because they'll poke holes through your rotor. If you happen to break one, it goes through the machine. So we put the fiber finger kit in there, and I put the header control on it, and it really panned out nice and worked good. I apologize for the pictures. I didn't get a picture of the combine. It was back in a dark corner in the shed, and I didn't think it would take very good. So I figured most guys knew what a combine looked like. Once you get it harvested, the rye, you want to harvest it at about 13% moisture. Make sure it's good and dry. One year I tried to cut some at 20%, and I thought I could dry it, and it ended up heating up on me, and it hurt the germination. I had to end up feeding that. So this shows where I store it when I harvest it. Most guys got an old bin on the farm like this that they think is too small to use for corn or bean bin anymore. So this one's got a full floor under here for the aeration, and as you can see just on the back there's a fan there that runs on it, and it's got an unloading system in it, and it works fairly well. You can put the rye in there. It's real easy to dry down. Just run a little bit of air on it, and it's not too hard to handle. And then once we get it harvested in the bin here, then I run it through a seed cleaner, and I didn't get a picture of that because it was at another farm, but we just took a regular double drum seed cleaner, and we took the screens out, and we put 3/16 screens in the center, and then I got some 1/8 inch just regular screen and put around the outside to keep everything in the drum, and it really worked well to clean the seed. Some guys ask if you have to clean the seed. It depends on your seeding equipment. If you're going to run it through a drill, it has to be clean. I can tell you that from experience because I run some through the drill one a couple years ago, and all I ended up with was a whole bunch of plugged seed tubes. You got to get those seed heads cleaned out of there. And this cleaner I set up worked really good. And once I run it through the cleaner, I run in this. This is an old bulk bin that I had on the farm, and that's got my clean seed in it. And I can run back my drill up to this auger in that conveyor that we had on the back of the drill. I can just fill it right up there. So I've got a grinder mixer I use when I'm away from this is on the home farm. When I'm on the other farm, I don't want to bring the drill back to fill it, so I just load up my grinder mixer, and it works really well to fill the drill or fill that broadcast seeder especially. And it works good. You've got a scale on there. You can tell exactly the pounds you need. I sold some rye this year to a couple different neighbors, and it really worked nice. They brought their bulk wagon or some of those plastic seed totes, and we just weigh out what they wanted and just run it right in the tote, and it really worked out well. So that's probably the best market for rye is if you got neighbors looking to buy it for cover crop seed. I started buying it when I first started there 10 years ago. I think it was running like $6 or $7 a bushel, and it's last fall here the going rate was about $15 to $16 a bushel. and I sent a sample of mine into Iowa State and did a germ test on it, and it come back between 71 and 75%, which was a little bit low, and I figured that was because it was lodged down on the ground, and we've lost a little bit of our germination because of that. So I just kind of calculated the price, and it came out to about $12 a bushel. So that's what I was selling seed for, versus the $15 at the seed dealers around the area. So the reason I started growing my own seed was because I wanted to start planting more seed. About 4 years ago, I had some pre-booked in August, and I planted all that I had, and I wanted to put some more out, and I went back to the dealers, and everybody was sold out. Nobody could get it, and that's about the time the price started going up. So I just decided, well, I could just grow it. And, the yields aren't real good, like Greg said. I did get some 40 bushel rye this last season. I think we got a picture of it here. Yeah, this is the rye that I harvested last summer. That rye was planted on bean ground. It was beans the year before, in the fall of 2013. Planted about the 20th of October, and we put about 2 bushel, a little over 2 bushel to the acre on there, and I had a pretty good stand. And I went in then about the 1st of April, and I used a stream bar on our sprayer, and I streamed on about 60 pounds or 60 units of 32% nitrogen, and it really responded well. It grew well. Here you can see how tall it got. This is a picture taken at our field day there last summer, and these guys are 6 feet tall, so you see how tall it got. And it really looked good until we got a couple of rainstorms in June and first part of July, and then a lot of that just went down terrible. So I'd like to find a variety of rye that didn't get so tall. Either that or try. I've kind of got mixed feelings on fertilizing rye. The stuff I put out this year, I just put manure on it this fall and then planted the rye, and I don't think I'm going to put anything on it next spring. So it just makes it grow too tall, and it just lodging becomes an issue. So here's a picture of our clover that we interseeded. That was the same patch of rye that in the previous photo that the guys were looking at, and I went in about the 1st of April when that started greening up, and I interseeded that red clover in there, and there's what it looked like. And the clover did real well where the rye was thin, and the rye did real well where the clover stand was thin. So it's kind of a typical double crop situation. It works good if you're going for cover crop. But if you're going for rye harvest, the stuff that I planted this year, I'm going to let go, and I'm going for maximum bushels on the rye, and then I'm going to go in after the harvest and no-till some either clover, or I might try some peas or hairy vetch or something else that I'd like to gain a little experience with. So. Here's a picture of the corn. This was rye that was combined the year before that we did the test plot for Practical Farmers. We went in and put some strips of red clover in, and I did some non-clover strips, and we did a yield check on this, and that rye was put in about the 20th of October the year before, in the fall before, and then I came in and put the clover strips in first week in April. This is a strip right here where it doesn't look like there was any clover. This was just straight rye. You can see the straw there is about a foot tall. That's where that was harvested then in mid-July, and then we just left it go over the summer, and then the following spring I came in there and I planted the corn in there. And I did go through there with a strip till. I've got an 8-row strip till bar that's got an anhydrous shank on it, and I laid out strips mainly so I could keep my strip straight and go from one to the next and skip them. I don't have a guidance system or anything, but I laid them out, and that way I knew where to plant my strips. So that's fairly good looking corn there, and we had corn in there that made 200 bushel with limited nitrogen on. We did different nitrogen rates, and the most economical was where I had the clover in the rye, and we had about between 4,000 and 5,000 pounds of biomass in there that we had mineralizing for us. So then we came back with about 100 pounds of nitrogen, and I was able to get 200 bushel corn with just 100 pounds of nitrogen in there. So the clover and the rye was making up for the rest of it. They were mineralizing it out of the ground. So I think these cover crops are going to become more and more popular. We've seen probably a threefold increase in cover crops in our part of the state. Washington County is one of the areas of the state that's highly no-till. I'd say probably 75 to 80% of the county is no-till, and this cover crop is just kind of a natural progression right into your no-till. It helps to hold your soil in place if you got highly erodible ground, and then some of these guys that are getting it in the fall in a timely manner, it's really helping to increase the organic matter. And it's just I originally started planting rye for cattle feed and forage, and then we after we baled that hay off and baled it wet, and then we go and plant soybeans in there, and then the soybeans would actually do just as good or even better on the rye ground than they were where we didn't have rye. And then plus you had the erosion control, and so after I seen that one, it's kind of like no-till. The more years you do it, the more advantage you're getting from it. It's just nice to have something covering that ground out there. Some of these guys that talking at these seminars and stuff, they refer to it as soil armor. Well, if you look at a picture like that, there's a lot of armor there on that soil. If you get a 4 or 5 inch rain, that's not going to move much soil right there compared to a field that's been tilled and all tore loose. So and they're finding advantages to the organic matter and the biological activity, and it's just there's a lot of benefits to it that are hard to measure. So looks like I'm probably out of time, Drake. I can quit there if somebody wants to ask some questions.
Yeah, sure. That sounds good. If you've gone through the bulk of your stuff, we definitely want to leave some time for questions. Folks, if you'd like to enter questions on the lower left part of your screen in the chat box there, that's where we'll ask questions. While people are thinking of their questions, I'm wondering, Greg, if maybe you would want to respond to Tim's thoughts there on sort of the trade-offs, both thinking about shorter varieties and then also the trade-off with fertilizing and the potential for lodging if you get that big boost of growth. If you could respond to that.
Yeah, I guess I just a lot of the fields I see around that are rye grown for grain. I think folks have been conservative on nitrogen, and they're worried about that lodging, and they'd rather not have it go down, so they're not pushing it very much. And 60 pounds would be the maximum, I think. And And then I guess what we're finding is as you build up your soils, they release more nitrogen. So then you got to be a little more conservative in that regard. And then where farmers have, I have some farmers that are really into cover cropping and small grains, and they're looking for some beans or corn that they can shorten up on to get started harvesting to dedicate some cover cropping fields for. Not that they're doing everything early. Let's say in our area, maybe 3-2, 3-3 soybeans would be typical, but and some folks might drop back to 2-8 or 2-9 plant, and they like to plant those early, and then those fields would be good candidates for small grains or good cover cropping in the fall. Just that if you have our planting and harvesting gets dragged out maybe more than yours does, so we have early and late planted fields. So if you have some fields you can harvest early, then those would be better candidates for getting cover crops in earlier. And I would say, add to Tim's thoughts, there's a lot of interest in mixing other things with your fall grain. And the earlier you go, the more you can do that. And that'd be crimson clover, red clover, even ryegrass is one that folks would mix in, and then it green up early and you could graze it or something. And by May 1st or May 15th, you'd be ready to get back into your full season row crop. So that's another thing I see happening in the cover crop revolution is diversification. Another inexpensive one that dairy farmers do with early planted rye or triticale would be to mix oats in, and then the oats grow in the fall. But you need to kind of do that that's pretty much a September operation. A mixture, a 50-50 mixture, maybe a rye and oats or something like that.
That's an interesting concept, having those two together, the oats and the rye. I know we had a cover crop event recently, and we saw some data about oats. And oftentimes, the oats, they sort of come and then go quickly. And so in the spring, some people feel they don't get the bang for the buck for the oats. But in fact, sort of the roots are still holding soil there. So if you got that rye to come in right behind it, that sounds like a great combination. So, Tim, any thoughts on that or other questions for Greg?
Yeah, Greg, getting back to your early planting, you were talking about planting it early. What's your planting dates out in Pennsylvania typically? What do you consider early planting date?
It depends a little bit where you're at, but for corn would be the last week of April, first week of May, something like that. Soybeans.
I was talking about the rye and
Well, September would be a early planting date after our silage corn. Yeah, that would be September.
Okay.
Early October. But like you said, we planted it all the way up until the ground freezes, and it's still, if it can germinate in the fall, then it'll grow in the spring and do surprisingly well.
Yeah. I bought all the Group 2 soybeans this this year to plant, so just for that reason, so I can get my beans all harvested by the end of September, and then I can start putting rye in October. But I had some that I put in just this past fall here, and I had good luck up until about the 20th of October, and then it turned off cold and dry. And I had some that we put in the 25th, and then I stopped after that because I thought it was getting too dry and too late. And the stuff I put it in with that broadcast seeder, and it didn't grow right away. I harrowed it in with that harrow, and I knifed manure in ahead of that, and it had the ground dried out, and it just didn't germinate. When I was out there here about 3-4 weeks ago, and that we had a warm spell in December, and that rye had germinated, and it had about an inch sprout on it just in December is when that sprouted. So it's pretty tough stuff.
And I had exactly the same experience in early October is when we plant our wheat, and we put our rye plots in at the same time, and the stuff comes up right away and looks beautiful and gets a fair amount of growth. But then in late October, it starts getting cold, and growth is small. And we planted some in November. We had a little goof up, and I realized we needed to plant some more, and we planted in November. And all through December, I went out and looked, and I could not see anything coming up. And then we must have got a warm shot too in December, late December, because I went back out there the first week of January, and I saw those 1-inch sprouts of rye sticking up through the soil. So it's pretty. It can grow at pretty low temperatures and germinate, and I think we're going to have a decent stand, but it was late planted.
Is it the case, Greg, if somebody was to plant, too late or be pushing the calendar, and those seeds didn't germinate in the first year, they would still grow in the spring, correct? But just maybe they wouldn't be able to set seed that first year since they hadn't gone through a dormant cycle? Or am I off base there?
No, I think actually I think if you plant it in sometimes we have these guys that want to plant the rye straw and they didn't get it done because the ground was not fit in the fall, and then they might go out in December or something, around Christmas even, and because they're desperate to get some of that, they were counting on that straw. And I think if you get a germination to occur and you get like 30 days of cold temperatures, the seeds will vernalize, and in most cases they will produce a seed. If you put, then the other question we get is, okay, now it's March and we didn't get it done. And if you plant rye then in March, it's not going to be vernalized, and then it'll just grow like a vegetative grass and not produce a seed head. And that might have some use, but that's not. You'd probably be better off then going with the spring grain if you really, really, really wanted to grow some straw. Like there's where we would recommend oats, as an alternative. So we can. I've never planted anything in January or late December, but I've kind of heard of a couple instances where folks would get it in the ground, it would germinate eventually, and get 30 days and produce a seed head.
Excellent. Yeah, I was talking to a gentleman a while back talking about rye, and he said that he would sort of refurbish his old alfalfa fields with rye in terms of get in there and no-chill drill rye right into the alfalfa, and it would sort of boost that first cutting of the hay crop the next year, but he wasn't concerned about heading out. He said the same thing. He tried to get in every year to do that after all the other crops were done, but some years it was February, and he would still get out there. But again, he was just looking for that biomass, not for the seed.
One thing that happens here is in that situation, in the last year of alfalfa, farmers will no-till rye or triticale in the fall in the alfalfa. and it will germinate, grow, and then that first cutting of alfalfa will be heavy with rye and a mixture of alfalfa, and then they'll after the first cutting, then they'll plant it back to corn.
Oh wow! So just get the one cut off and turn it under.
Yeah, but it'll take a thin stand and make a big first cutting. Now, people have told me it's not going to be like your typical pure alfalfa. It's going to be a mixture, a higher fiber first cutting, but it's going to make a lot of stuff.
Yep, the gentleman I was talking to said the same thing. His pitch was sort of, you want to make $800 an acre. Well, I make 800 or 8 tons per acre with that rye boost in the alfalfa. That was with cuttings throughout the year. So we're getting to just sort of the last few minutes. I wonder, Tim, if you had any closing thoughts or thoughts that have come to mind. A great presentation. I hope folks in the audience have learned a lot. They're a little quiet tonight with the questions, but I don't think that maybe it just means you guys covered the topic so well. So I'll leave a few minutes for closing thoughts if you have any. Go ahead, Tim, first if you got some.
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention is the straw. That's another income stream that you can pull off of that. And Greg mentioned that too. We've got several sheep producers in our area, and they just love buying that rye straw if you got it baled in small square bales. So that's another thing to think about. But this rye is about the best thing you can plant for winter hardiness. I've grown wheat. I had some bad winter kill on wheat one year, and then Greg alluded to it earlier. There's not a very lucrative wheat market in Iowa, but the rye is, if you got a good demand in the area, you can get some farmers looking for some seed for cover crop, and then also anybody that's growing any, you might have a custom combining opportunity also. I've got 2 neighbors that are starting to grow more of it, and they don't like to get their combine out in the middle of the summer, and so it's something else that you can think about. So there's a lot of ways you can work it into your rotation. You just got to kind of think outside the box sometimes, but I don't see it as dwindling in popularity because of this water quality thing and the nutrient reduction and that kind of stuff, and it just kind of fits right in with that. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity here to refine these cover crops, and anybody that learns how to do it now is going to have an advantage when it comes to more regulation and stuff down the road. So other than that, that's about all I have for tonight.
Okay, that's great. I agree about the growing popularity. I see Jake Spence ask in the chat box about average straw yield, and I know Greg had mentioned 3 tons per acre, but those were the folks that were sort of not harvesting the seed and just sort of taking it right before flowering. And I'm wondering, Tim, what you get for straw yield off your fields.
Oh. Okay, you're cutting out on me, Drake, but I think you were asking about straw yield. Typically, the stuff that we did last summer here that we combined that was in that plot field there, that field right there, I got about 100 right at 100 bales, small square bales to the acre off of that. And you figure $3 a bale is what I get for it. So there's $300 that you can take off in straw. But then you got the added fertilizer you got to put back on. But if you got hog manure available like I do, you can kind of offset that a little bit. So that livestock really works in, and Greg mentioned that too. It's great for cattle feed, great for grazing in the spring and the fall, and livestock really is another way to capitalize on it.
Yep, absolutely. All right, Greg, there's just a minute left here. So do you have any closing thoughts you want to leave us with?
Just often there's other benefits besides even the feed and the harvested commodity. The nutrient reduction, nitrates are reduced a lot by these small grains. That's one thing. Another thing we've noticed, we're starting to get Palmer amaranth in our soybeans, and mare's tail, herbicide-resistant weeds. And folks have told us that, geez, where I got a great cover crop like rye out there, it's really knocked that mare's tail back on its own without any herbicides. If you're really sharp, you can put a herbicide on the small grain and clear up a lot of those problems. That's another dimension and added value to the system. And that's about it.
All right, great. I think that was a high note to leave us on. That's something we don't think about a lot, and I keep a list of sort of the small grain benefits, and that's in there, but I'm going to make sure to highlight that, the added potential for weed control, especially as we come up against herbicide-resistant weeds. So once again, I want to thank Greg Roth from Penn State Extension and farmer Tim Sieren. Great discussion tonight. The archived Farminar of tonight's session will be up on our website probably by the end of the day tomorrow, along with all the archive Farminars. Some of the Farminars are some of our most popular content. Some of them, we now have over 17,000 views on our archive Farminars. So check those out, and I look forward to seeing you live here next week when we talk about custom grazing with goats. Thanks again, and everyone have a great evening, and stay warm.